Are you putting out a link?
Yep. And welcome, everybody. It is week 16, championship weekend. And boy, do we got a big one for you today on the Fantasy Football Hustle. Welcome in, everybody. I am Brian Drake, fightingchancefantasy.com. Might help if I change things so you can actually see us over here. How's it going, everybody? Welcome in. I hope you're all playing for something this weekend. I know in a lot of leagues that I'm in, I'm not, unfortunately. But with Dwayne and I at the helm here, we're going to guide you to a title. I'm joined, as always, by Dwayne McFarland of Establish the Run, Matt Waldman, RSP.com, and Football Guys. And do we have a guest, Dwayne, on the hook tonight? Boy, we go big, and then we go real big. And I don't think it gets any bigger in fantasy football, especially in season long, than our guest tonight, Chad Schroeder.
Absolutely. Welcome, Chad.
Good to be here, guys. This is a great show you guys put on. It's the exact type of information that I like. You know, Dwayne's stuff is second to none, as I've mentioned to him. I kind of look at it as like if you're playing poker or solitaire, if you make you use Dwayne's information to make the right decision, and then it's sort of out of your control after that. And the scores the guys actually are putting up or what happens after the flop and it's out of your hands. That's kind of how I look at Dwayne's stuff. And, you know, like I think back to like the Dolphins game, the first game of the year, Marquise Brown played like 18% of the snaps and scored like 1 million points. I still had a hard time trusting him after that. Whereas the average player that's not looking at Dwayne's stuff might just auto start him, which worked out fine. But
yeah, sometimes pocket threes still hit, Chad. You know, and you hit a set on the flop, but you know, it's not necessarily. You don't want to take it in against ace, you know, king, queen, if you can avoid it.
Now, we are the full-time fantasy sports network here. We appreciate those guys being on board. I know you play in some of those contests over there at the FFWC that those guys run. And let me give you guys for context, because there's a lot of casual fans that listen, and then we've got some really, you know, in-depth hardcore guys that listen. And thank you to each and every one of you guys for checking out the show this week. Let me put this into perspective. We're talking to the guy who's the all-time leading money winner in the NFFC. He's in their Hall of Fame. He's the number 1 ranked player in fantasy football 5 years running. The reigning defending, I feel like I'm Paul Heyman here doing on Monday Night Raw. The reigning defending NFFC primetime and FFWC world champion, a guy who's won over $10,000 30 different times. That's from an old article. It's probably well past that. I can't believe how much cash you're winning, my friend, but welcome into the show. Thanks for being here. And just, wow. How the hell does a guy, you know, go from Omaha, Nebraska to being the number 1 fantasy football player in the world?
I don't know. You know, I'm not self-proclaiming myself to be that. That's just what the rankings have me at, which are a little bit flawed. But anyway, it all kind of started back in 2008. And I actually had the chance to meet Dwayne that year in Vegas in the finals of a large event. I don't know if you want me to get into the skinny on that, but it was quite a deal. But ever since, that sort of launched my career, made me realize what was possible, and it actually refocused me and made me want to try even harder after what happened that weekend. So
what did happen that weekend? So you go out to Vegas, and I mean, that's got to be an insane scene. You were a guy who was a stockbroker by trade. And then I was reading that you got into fantasy football after the market crash around 2007.
No, in like 2000, I was working as like a mid manager at Ameritrade.
Okay.
And the market crashed and a lot of layoffs, and then I went into sports gambling, and I've been doing that ever since. And then around 2007, the government kind of shut down offshore sports betting and poker.
Okay.
And then I explored fantasy football as a way to supplement my income, and it's rest is history, I guess you would say. But out there in Vegas, in 2008, there was a new contest. It was like believe it was around $150 a team, Dwayne. Is that right? Something like that?
Yeah, I think it was 150. But you get like if you did like a 3-pack, I think it was $300 for the whole thing or something, or 350, something like that.
So anyway, you had to win a 10-man league after week 9, I believe, maybe week 10. And then every week from then on, there was cuts, and it got significantly harder and harder as you went to make it. I actually entered 21 times, I think. I don't know how many Dwayne did, but the bottom line is that the last week of the season, the final 15 in week 15, the final 15 that made the cut got flown to the Bellagio, and the first place prize was $1 million. And
wow.
I actually had 2 cracks at it. I had 2 of the final 15, and to make a long story short, I think I was probably about a 99% favorite going into the Sunday night game, maybe 98.
Really?
D'Angelo Williams basically needed, like, in non-PPR, mind you, Jonathan Stewart was there, and he got most of the goal line work. D'Angelo needed like 28, and I had the New York Giants defense who he was playing against. So in non-PPR, he needed to outscore the Giants defense by 28, or I win the $1 million. So everybody's kind of getting restless after being in this room at the Bellagio all day, watching these games. So the operators of the game said, everybody can leave if you want now. You don't have to stay here for the Sunday night game. They go, Chad, will you and your boys stick around? We'd like to film you winning the $1 million. I'm like, yeah, talk about a jinx.
Oh.
And then Jonathan Stewart gets hurt on his first carry of the game, so that started the ball rolling. And then D'Angelo scores a quick touchdown, and they come up and ask me how I felt about that. I go, not ideal start, that's for sure. And then the next thing you know, Steve Smith gets pass interfered with in the end zone. So 1 yard line, D'Angelo scores again, and they keep coming up and asking me how I feel about that touchdown. I'm starting to get a little more, starting to not like this situation. And eventually, and the Giants dropped like 3 easy interceptions, just easy picks. And it was just starting to become apparent that it wasn't going to happen. And finally, in the fourth quarter, about halfway through the fourth quarter, I got passed. And next thing you know, here comes everybody back into the room to watch the end of this.
Oh, no.
Debacle. But it was a hell of a time. That night afterwards.
I mean, you just literally lost $1 million. I mean,
900,000. I got second, which is 100,000. So yeah.
People can't comprehend that. They'd be sick to their stomach. They'd be jumping out of windows. How do you handle something like that?
It was very, very difficult. And we went up to the hotel room for a bit, and there was an event at the club that night, and we didn't really feel like going to it. But Jerry Rice was there, sort of promoting the event, and they asked. I didn't want to come across as a sore loser and not go, So
sure,
we went down there, and turned out we were the only ones that showed up at it, actually, out of the 15 people. So me and my buddy Justin and my uncle Kelly, we just decided to put it behind us and had a hell of a time. We partied till about 5 a.m. with Jerry Rice, and
no way.
Time, but
wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
I'm always obsessed with the process. I love anybody who is excellent at what they do, and I love to get in their head and find out what makes them tick. How do they prepare? Who do they follow? Who do they read? What's their path? And that's all stuff we're going to get into here with Chad. And we're also going to have him here as we go through the Week 16 information that you guys have come to know and love from the Fantasy Football Hustle. We're going to have Dwayne and his utilization reports here, and we can actually bring them up on the screen this week. See, we're growing this show. And as a special treat, at the end of this interview here with Chad, we've got the 2-time high stakes champ pal, Drake Jordan. If you've seen him on Twitter, Drake Jordan loves to mess with all these fantasy football so-called experts out there, and he's dominating the social media realm in fantasy. And we got him, and he's going to come on here in about 45 minutes to an hour, and you're going to have that interview. So stick around for all that. But Chad and Dwayne, let's get into this Week 16 talk here. And I think we have to start with the Minnesota Vikings. Dalvin Cook, we're not exactly sure if he's going to play. Adam Schefter was saying he's leaning towards not playing. Alexander Mattison could be coming back. But that just leaves on the waiver wire Mike Boone, who scored 2 touchdowns this past week. And he's kind of like, as Adam Levitan from ETR always says, team preseason. Mike Boone could play if he has to. So, Dwayne, let's throw it over to you. We'll talk about the utilization, and then we'll talk about, who we should add. Should we add Boone at all? And just our thoughts on this Viking situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we gained some clarity on why Madison didn't get more work the week before. Remember, whenever Dalvin Cook, only got 43% of the snaps, 46% of the attempts. We were really expecting that to happen, and we thought Madison might even be a viable play. Last week for folks, he ended up not being. Well, it was because he got hurt. Now we know that based on the injury reports and then him missing the game last week. And to your point, yeah, it was Boone that took the majority of the rushing attempts, 35%. For the team. Cook only played 43% of the snaps, took 24% of the rushing attempts. So really it was Boone that took the rest. Amir Abdullah, he saw a handful, 14%. So yeah, I mean, I think if you're looking at Minnesota this coming week, the tough part is it's a Monday night game. You have a good matchup versus Green Bay, which is great. But it's just one of those situations where you're going to be left hanging until the last moment because you've also got Mike Zimmer saying that, Cook can probably play through this, which is what they've been saying, and he just keeps getting hurt again. Yeah. So we could have any range of scenarios, right? One could be Dalvin Cook starts the game, gets hurt, and then it's just Mike Boone left. But if Alexander Mattison starts practicing this week, maybe gets a full practice in by the weekend, then we're looking at it probably being Alexander Mattison. I would still think would be the lead guy after Dalvin Cook, but Boone played well enough that it could just be a pain in the ass, to where you could be dealing with both of those guys splitting carries. Plus, if Madison's not fully healthy, for me right now, I mean, I love the matchup versus Green Bay. They've been terrible, at times this season against the run. But man, I would rather not have to be counting on this situation. And believe me, I'm dealing with it in multiple leagues. I've got Dalvin Cook in several leagues. I've got Alexander Mattison sitting on several teams that are still alive. So it's a big pain in the butt. So, I mean, I'll be curious to see what Chad's thoughts are on it heading into Monday.
Yeah. On the leagues where there's still waivers, which a lot of the listeners are in those, I'm in several that are, several that aren't. But I think we're going to talk about the Tampa Bay situation here shortly. But as far as to sort of prioritize things, if you're good at wide receiver and you don't have any need to try an OJ Howard off the waiver wire, I think Boone's would be a better ad than those guys if you're not going to start those guys anyways. This is where you get into things like you want to see who your opponent, if he's got Dalvin Cook and you control the bidding, you want to get Mike Boone. For one, it puts him in an uncomfortable situation. And he may want to get at Amir Abdullah as well. So it might not allow him to take it down to Monday night. If you have Dalvin Cook, you definitely want to try to get Boone. I'm assuming Madison's gone already. If he's not, then depending on when your waivers run, you got to watch the news. But there's not much to be done at this point in these waiver wires, so why not add Boone to your team and see what happens, especially if you don't need one of those Tampa Bay players to start for you.
Let's move on to Tampa Bay, and it's a situation now where Chris Godwin's injured, Mike Evans is injured, but, man, they just keep throwing the football. Jameis Winston's going to throw for 400 yards, and he's probably going to throw 4 picks. But, wow, here comes Brashad Perriman. Dwayne, he goes 5 catches for 113 and 3 touchdowns. Holy smokes, on 6 targets. I mean, there's nobody else here. It's Perriman. Even that, didn't Justin Watson or Scotty Miller got hurt, right? So now he's out.
He's out.
So I mean, it's Perriman, it's a bunch of receivers. You or I might get called up. It's a disaster down there, but Perriman's probably on 80% of the wires across the country.
Yeah, he's going to be out there a lot. I did in several leagues last week. I picked up Perriman just where I needed a receiver. I loved the matchup as well. Versus Detroit. They've been shredded. You knew they were playing in a dome, so you didn't have to worry about weather like several of the games across the league. So Perriman was great. He's one of those guys that I don't know about Chad, and I know you do, Drake, but Sunday morning, usually I get 10 to 15 texts just from different buddies and whatnot. Hey, who should I start? And several of them I said, is Perriman on your wire? And they're like, yeah, but I have this. I'm like, just go grab Perriman and start him. So it was one of those days where, I'm wrong plenty, but it was one of those days where I got all these texts from them basically saying, dude, you just sent me to the championship game because of what Perriman did. So yeah, I mean, if he's available, he's a guy to add. One thing I am monitoring here, Drake, well, real quick before I jump into that, Perriman, the good news is it's not like it was just, this past week. Really in the weeks leading up to that, you're already starting to see some chemistry with Winston. He had started playing more snaps. So week 13, he was up to 59% of the snaps, ran a route on 77% of the dropbacks as Tampa was moving more to, they were running a lot of 11 personnel that game. And then the last 2 weeks, even in week 14, 96%, of the routes per dropback, and then last week, 98%. But his targets, actually in week 13, he saw 18%, which had been his, season high. And that was before Mike Evans and Chris Godwin were hurt. So, defenses were already making adjustments to try to take those guys away, it's hard to take 2 of them away. But the good news is you're already starting to see some mojo between Perriman and between Winston. And the good thing for Perriman, we talked about this a little bit last week, he's the guy that really does step into Mike Evans' role. And it's the most valuable role. It's not that Chris Godwin's bad, but Evans, I like his role better because of the average depth of target. If you look at Evans over the season, he's a 15.7. Perriman is the guy they want to stretch the field and go vertical with, which is what Bruce Arians' offense is about. Plus, you had a big slot receiver, which is where Chris Godwin plays, but you can get a big play at any time. Now, the thing that I'm monitoring, and I'll be, I want to hear Chad's thoughts on how he thinks about weather. But the way I think about weather, anytime you get 15 plus mile an hour winds, especially 20 mile an hour winds or more, and then if you add any sort of elements to that, that can be a real bummer on a passing game, especially if, your winds are side to side. If your winds, are going up and down the field every other quarter, you can be fine. They have to take a little bit off. Throwing into the winds, not ideal, but quarterbacks can, seem to adjust to that better. But when the winds are gusting from side to side, it can really hurt the deep passing game. And right now, we'll have to monitor this through the week, but Houston at Tampa Bay, which this stinks because, a lot of great options in Houston too, versus Tampa Bay, the best passing matchup in the league heading into championship weekend, 18 mile an hour winds are what's expected right now. And there's possible rain. So that's something to monitor. If that, stays, 15 to 10 mile an hour, and if it's only a chance of slight rain, it's just occasional, that's something Winston's used to dealing with. He's played in those type of elements before. A lot of times early in the season, you'll get the occasional rain, if you're playing in Tampa or in Miami. Same thing will be happening in Miami, a little bit less wind. So we've got to watch that. So yeah, I think Perriman's an option. You heard Chad talk a little about OJ Howard. He mentioned him a minute ago. Howard's snaps and his routes per drop back haven't really changed, but over the last 3 weeks, his targets 18%, 10%, and 17%. Those are 3 of his highest marks, for the season. Actually, last weekend, he was the number 1 target by a slight margin for Tampa. And they really didn't need to throw the ball on their final 2 drives because there was a pick 6 that, Detroit threw late. So really the last drive that Tampa had, when it, the Detroit had actually came back and made the game, I think a 1-score game at that point, which was great. And then there was a pick 6. So they just let their foot off the gas and they mostly just ran the ball. I think there's a chance Howard, gets, 19, 20% of the targets if that doesn't happen. But with Scotty Miller gone, Chris Godwin gone, I really think OJ Howard is the guy that has a chance to really replace a lot of what Chris Godwin was doing, being the guy working inside the hashes, being the guy getting more of the intermediate targets, while Perriman can be the guy stretching the field.
I saw a beat reporter for Tampa Bay tweeted out today that Jameis Winston walked into the facility and he was talking to the tight ends, Howard and Brate, and he said, boys, get ready because the ball's coming to you this week. So
yeah,
to see that kind of stuff coming out, it's like,
well, with Scotty Miller gone,
Braid's going to be dirt cheap in DFS.
Yeah, with Scotty Miller gone, it's a great point, Drake. Like you could see a lot of Cameron Brate from the slot, and then you could see, OJ Howard lined up in line. Then you've got Perriman, lined up outside along with Justin Watson.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of this situation, Chad?
First, I want to be clear. I mentioned before that I would add Mike Boone if you don't need a Tampa receiver. I was probably distorted a little bit because almost all the leagues I'm in, Perriman is owned now. I would prioritize Perriman over Mike Boone in almost all scenarios because I believe he's a very, very viable play if the winds and weather cooperate at least to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking more on the lines of, I'd rather have Boone on my team than adding a guy like Watson, who I also think could be viable. And one of my bigger leagues, it's a 14-team, really big league, and I'm in the finals, and I might have to go there because I was a Godwin owner and Perriman's not available. So I think Watson passes the eye test for me. It's a bit of a leap of faith, but I think he can get it done. As far as OJ Howard, if the weather's, actually the weather might not be quite as big of a deal for him catching shorter passes over the middle, but ideally the weather's better than not. I think I'm inclined at this point to say to hell with the projections I look at and use my brain here a little bit. And Winston's a gunslinger and he's down a lot of weapons.
They can't
I think
run.
Howard's a better option than guys like Hollister, Gesicki, those types of players this week. What do you guys think about where do you draw the line on where to start Howard?
We had a question in our chat room a second ago, and the gentleman asked, and we appreciate all the guys who come and jump in the chat and ask us questions. He goes, Hollister or Howard in terms of a tight end this week, because Hollister gets Arizona, and we know how bad they've been against the tight end all year long. So if that was your scenario, guys, which player would you choose?
That's a good point.
Yeah, yeah, that's that makes it a little tougher. The good thing with Hollister, I don't have his info up, in front of me, right now, but his routes per drop back, his snaps, everything is still intact. We know that Russell Wilson's willing to go to the tight end. We've seen it with Hollister already. We saw it with Will Dissly early in the season before his injury. So if you own Hollister, I do think that makes it tougher. Here's what I will say though, that if the weather does cooperate and you think you're a dog in your championship game, I think that OJ Howard still carries more upside because he's an elite talent. Jacob Hollister's a nice player. OJ Howard, though, is still a first-round pick, out of a big program in Alabama. Like Chad said, the eye test, OJ Howard definitely passes it. I know he's done some things that have frustrated his coaches, but it's nothing to do with, whenever the ball's coming to him. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I mean, maybe he's running some of the wrong routes or he's reading coverages wrong. Who knows what all's going on there? But as far as just the pure talent, it's definitely there. So if I was a dog going into the game, and I thought I needed to, really try to do something to spice things up to give me a chance, to beat a better roster, I would play OJ Howard in that scenario. If I think that I'm favored, to win, and not just looking at what your site projects, but if you really feel like, hey, you're the favorite in the game, then I'm probably sticking with Hollister.
You know what? I love the fact that we have a guy on who's so successful and he's playing for big money out there. And it doesn't matter if you're playing for pride this weekend, you're playing for just a trophy, you're playing for $500, or you're like Chad, who's playing for hundreds of thousands of dollars. It all matters. And you've got to make sure that you're making smart decisions. And don't just say, hey, I made it to the finals. This is my team. I'm rolling with my team. This is a 1-week season. You've got the whole waiver wire at your disposal. You got to almost play it like it's your roster as DFS. You've got everybody at your disposal. Let me ask you, Chad, your question. A question that's been going around fantasy Twitter for a while. In terms of players who are not in the playoffs, adding and dropping. I know in a league that I commission, we have a rule: once you're eliminated from the playoffs, your team is locked. You cannot add drop. So I'm just curious, a guy who plays in leagues like you, what's your thoughts on that?
There's no, in my opinion, there's no reason for anyone to be making a pickup that's not playing for a dollar amount of any sort, certainly.
Totally agree.
Now I'm a little fuzzier on when there's consolation brackets for minimal prizes. Mm-hmm. I can go either way, whether to allow them to bid or not. I could go either way on that, but certainly nobody should be picking up guys when they're not playing for a dollar.
If you're dying at wide receiver and you miss out on Perriman and you can't get these Miami guys who we'll talk about in a minute, here's a name that is so off the radar that nobody in your league owns this guy, and that's Steven Sims from the Washington Redskins. I saw him play against the Eagles, and he just ate them alive. Team high 11 targets, Dwayne, 5 for 45 and a touchdown. This kid's got speed to burn, and they have nothing outside of Terry McLaurin.
Yeah, if you think back to, the preseason, a name that you were hearing a lot, as a late round, prospect, for fantasy this season was Trey Quinn, the guy out of LSU, then transferred to SMU. And really that just never came to fruition. But now you do have a slot receiver in Washington, and it is Steven Sims. And earlier in the season, they were using him, in some different kind of ways, getting him some packages, running some reverses, doing some different things with him, just to try to get him the ball. Well, now he's just continued to evolve as a player. And if you look at his snaps over the last 2 weeks, 71 and 70%. But the more important thing is on Dwayne Haskins dropbacks. He ran a route in week 14 on 100% of those. And then last week, 94%. So he's really, he's right there at the number 2 receiver, playing just as much as Kelvin Harmon. But he's a more explosive player. He's playing inside the hashes. He's protected by the slot, which is almost always good because the best corners won't typically travel to the slot. Plus, you have Terry McLaurin as protection, and you've got to respect Terry McLaurin's vertical speed. So that opens up a lot of things, for a guy like Sims that other teams don't know about. They're going to have a little bit more film on him. But over the last 2 weeks, you nailed it, Drake. 26% and 39% of the targets. He's got an end zone target in that time. He's operating that intermediate range, 7.7, 9.7, and 10.8 average depth of target. So he's an easy guy to find. He's getting good matchups. And if you're in a deeper league,
Giants.
Yeah, you're in a deeper league like the ones Chad was talking about, which I'm in some of those where you're in you got 14 men, or you may be in a 12 man that's got super deep, benches. Yeah, Steven Sims, is going to be one of the guys that I would be pushing, further to the top. I mean, the other good news, is Haskins doesn't look great, but he's at least looking, functional, at this point. Early on, it just wasn't good at all. And now he's at least, keeping them, in games. They are depending on the run more, but it's actually helped the passing game. It's taken some of the weight off of Haskins' shoulders. And Sims does, like you said, he's got that explosive, ability. So on any touch, he could also, take one, to the house. So if you've got a guy getting that kind of volume and they've got big playability, it's always someone that I would pay attention to.
How would you prioritize Sims and Watson?
I like Sims over Watson personally, by a hair, Chad. One, I feel better about, the volume that I know he's getting. And Terry McLaurin's really the only other guy they have, unless Chris Thompson really gets involved, which he was 2 weeks ago. He had 30% of the targets. But I don't have to worry about the weather either. And it's in a matchup where I feel like, the Redskins should be able to hang in. We should have a competitive, type game. So I mean, you've got Washington playing against the Giants, like like Brian said, there's no total out from Vegas right now, but you know how those NFC East games go. It could be 28 points, or it could be 45, 50 points. So I feel just slightly better, about Sims, just when I consider everything. If I was for sure about the weather, I would put it more at a coin flip. But right now, I would slightly put Sims ahead.
If there's any chance,
this is why this is the best show, folks. By the way, some of you that are listening tonight for the first time, where else do you hear about Steven Sims other than maybe some daily shows that are recommending a guy because he's the minimum price? But we're talking full season football here, and some people like me are up against it with injuries and stuff, and are still somehow in the finals, and that's why this show's the best. Who here knew that Sims ran 100% of routes on Haskins passes? that's listening to this show.
Yeah.
I bet you could count them on 0 fingers.
Maybe just the 2-time dynasty champ. He's probably already got him on roster.
Well, of course he did.
Yeah, he doesn't need us.
Well, you know who needs help out there? And if you'll look at my Christmas tree behind me, it's decorated in Philadelphia Eagles light up ornaments, by the way. I didn't even know they lit up until my 7-year-old was playing with the tree and turned them all on. But the Philadelphia Eagles need help, okay? We've got this big game this weekend for the NFC East title against the Cowboys. Dwayne and I might do something fun at halftime and come on and do a show, but it's bad, okay? They have 3 receivers. They've got a rookie in Arcega-Whiteside, and that's how I'm going to say his name. It's not Arcega. I can't do it that way. Arcega-Whiteside shouldn't be on the field.
It's Arcega-Whiteside.
I'm not doing it. I don't care. I don't care if he comes on our show and punches me in the face. Robert Davis, who they got off the practice squad of the Redskins, who's kind of a speedy guy. But really, the player here, Dwayne, is the former college quarterback, Greg Ward, who's got 9 targets in the last 2 weeks and caught the game-winning touchdown. I know he's on wires.
Yeah, 19 PPR points last week. And, you called it. I actually gave you props in the Establish the Run article today, Drake. I called you out since you say I never mentioned my co-host, because I don't want everybody to know they can just get all this information from you. No. But yeah, he played slightly less than Arcega-Whiteside. If you look at the routes per dropback, 87% in week 14, 83% last week versus Whiteside at 94 and 91%. But still, if you look at the targets, there's something to be said. I definitely look at routes per dropback and snaps. But if some people take it too literally, when it's that close, I still care who the quarterback's looking for. So 20 and 21% of the targets for Ward over the last 2 weeks, and only 4 and 5% for Arcega-Whiteside over those last 2. I'm going to keep saying it that way just to drive you crazy.
I'm never doing it until they cut the kid.
So Ward is the guy that, I think what you're seeing, and you've heard some of this, but this is a former quarterback. He's a great athlete. So he understands, the game. He understands all the ins and outs, of the way these route combos work and all of these things. Whereas it's probably something that Arcega-Whiteside is still learning, right? All he's ever played is receiver, and Stanford honestly didn't ask him to do a lot. They asked him to run a lot of goes, a lot of stops, win a lot of 50-50 balls. He's a great contested catch player. But at this point in his career, Ward just seems to be the more complete guy. And if you look at the way they're using him, they're moving him all around the formation. Slot percentage, 75, 51, and 56%. Nelson Aguilar, if he comes back, could throw a little bit of a wrench in that. So I think that's something to monitor. This week, if Aguilar comes back, Ward's role is probably going to be reduced.
I wouldn't be surprised if they kicked Aguilar outside because they have nothing outside with Whiteside.
It could happen too, to your point, but we just don't have a data point on it. And Aguilar's typically struggled when he's played outside. So I don't know what they'll do. All I'll say is I would feel less comfortable about the way it's going to work out if Aguilar's back. If Aguilar's not back, I think it's Zach Ertz, Goddard, Ward, and Boston Scott. Of course, Miles Sanders. I mean, those are going to be the guys carrying the load, in the passing game. Boston Scott, some people may have thought he was just a flash in the pan, but if you remember the way Doug Peterson handles his backs, he loves to have a receiving back. That's why he brought Darren Sproles. That's why he kept Darren Sproles when he came in. Chip Kelly had originally brought in Darren Sproles. But last week, 43 and 45% of the snaps the last 2 weeks, Drake. Rushing attempts only 31 and 21%, but his routes per dropback, 33 and 40%, targets 12 and 16%. So when he's on the field, they're specifically drawing things up for him. And they kind of have to right now, because as you said, no Alshon Jeffrey, maybe no Nelson Aguilar. They had already lost to Sean Jackson. Matt Collins is gone. They let him go. Jordan Matthews is gone. Like you said, Robert Davis got a little bit of playing time along with
It's a
Joshua
fraternity
Perkins.
fantasy. It's like a frat league flag football team. It's awful.
Right. So these guys could all, be viable. This is a game where the Eagles are playing the Cowboys, and whoever wins it's going to win the division. So I expect them to put everything out there. It is a bit risky, though. I don't feel as good about this as some of the other situations that we've talked about, because I could still see it going either way, where all of a sudden Ward doesn't do anything, but Dallas Goedert is the guy that steps up, because we saw his routes per dropback jump back into major fantasy relevance last week. He played 84% of the snaps. That's only 4% less than Ertz. Routes per dropback, 81%, also only 4% less than Ertz, but he saw 14% of the targets versus 23% for Ertz. But he's seeing time in the slot, 50% and 37% over the last 2 weeks. So he's a guy they like to move around the formation as well. And he's a guy that I know Wentz trusts and has more chemistry with. So Ward is a little bit trickier, but if you're in a super deep league, and maybe you don't have as much waiver wire dollars and you get blocked by somebody on some of the other names that we've talked about or the ones that we're still going to talk about, he's certainly viable. And then I would put Boston Scott at runner kind of in that same category. It's really emergency break glass. I think he's going to be okay, Drake, but there is a scenario because the Cowboys, look, I expect them to come out and be competitive, but the Cowboys are known just to lay major eggs in situations.
Destroy the Eagles. The
you
Eagles
say that
score 10 points.
You say that, but the Cowboys have been supposed to destroy multiple teams and just laid eggs, in big moments this year. And if that does happen, then Boston Scott's role is dependent on a competitive game or the Eagles trailing. So there is a scenario where all of a sudden, if that doesn't happen, you could be staring at 2 points from a guy like Boston Scott. So you just have to remember that.
You're right. The Cowboys suck. So
why do I have to convince an Eagles fan of this? Jesus.
Hey, I'm a Dolphins fan, guys.
Oh, God.
We're getting to them. Quickly, one last thing on Greg Ward. So he was the guy who caught the game-winning touchdown, and they spoke to him after the game, and he said that same exact play that they ran was a play that they tried on the goal line, I believe the drive before, and he was wide open. And he went back and he told Wentz, he goes, run that again. I'm open. The coaches looked at it, and he was. And they came back to it, and he said in the postgame, he goes, I knew the ball was coming to me. And as soon as the ball was snapped, Wentz went right to him, and they scored. So it shows that the coaching staff likes him. Wentz trusts him a little bit. So you could do a lot worse, I guess, than Greg Ward. Where are we now? It's week 16. We're talking about Greg freaking Ward. And we're also going to talk about, Chad, some of your Dolphins here because they can't run the ball to save their lives, but man, can Fitzpatrick sling it. If you got to stream a QB and, Fitzmagic's out there, he's going against the Bengals. He's got over 20 points, 3 of his last 4 DK points and 3 of his last 4. Fire him up. So let me get your thoughts here quickly on, Devontae Parker, Albert Wilson, this whole passing game.
I don't really.
Chad, are you going to tell the story about how you became a Dolphins fan? Wasn't it something to do with like pajamas?
Yeah, my darn parents, they were broke as hell. I was born when they were very young, and there happened to be some Dolphins pajamas in the bargain bin at the local store, and so I got some Dolphins pajamas, and that was bad turn of events.
You were locked in from there.
Well, speaking of locked in, Devontae
Parker is
Parker
very viable, though, to answer your question. I mean, they have nobody else to throw to, and Fitzpatrick will just sling it at him, and Fitzpatrick's viable. There's a lot of Patrick Laird funny stuff going on Twitter around it. And I'd be careful with him. It's trending a little bit more towards Gaskin as we go here, it seems like.
Yeah, with Laird, that's a great point. It's the snaps were split last week, Chad, at 48%. Rushing attempts, 48% for Laird, 36% for Gaskin. But the routes per dropback, Gaskin passed Laird 38% versus 31%. Whereas the week before, when Laird put up 12 PPR points, 59%, and he still saw 10% of the targets. But to be viable in Miami's offense, it can't be something where you're splitting things down the middle because this backfield is, such a mess. You need to be getting the majority of it. And really, you need to be the guy getting the receptions. And if Laird doesn't have that locked down, I'm with Chad. It's a guy that I'm definitely avoiding, this week if I can. And I also don't trust Gaskin enough to really put him in. I would have to be in the deepest of deepest leagues, for that, to occur. And I would still be trying to avoid it.
Agreed.
What world are we in where Devontae Parker and Brashad Perriman are finally relevant, Drake?
I've had Devontae Parker. I traded Kenyon Drake in a big league to get Parker straight up, and I didn't make the playoffs. So I'm in this consolation bracket, but you win like this golden toilet. It's a whole big thing for the league. I won it last year, and I'm trying to defend my toilet. And I was out of town, and I forgot to put Devontae Parker in my lineup. What? For Zach Pascal. Thank God I still won.
Drake, come on, man.
I shouldn't tell people. I forgot to set
No, it's all right.
It's a consolation bracket. Who cares?
Hey, we're human. Hey, Albert, just real quick on the Dolphins before we jump on. Albert Wilson last week, 80% of the snaps, 83% of the routes per dropback. That was second on the team outside at receiver, outside of Devontae Parker, who was at 98%. 17%, of the targets. Another guy that's a little shaky. He's had a lot of injury problems, but he is a guy that, he's a decent player. When you can get him involved, you get the ball to him in space, you let him do a little bit of the run after the catch stuff. He works mostly out of the slot. 88% of his routes came there. But with Jakeem Grant gone, last week, Alan Hearns was coming into the week. He ended up playing, but he was dinged up all week on the injury report. So I don't know how much of it is due to Hearns being hurt. So Wilson had to play more. Because, the other thing that kind of scares me on it is you saw the week before where Isaiah Ford actually played well when given the chance when Devontae Parker left the game with a concussion. So this isn't necessarily a trend that I would say that is locked in, but again, a super deep league, since we're hitting all the crazy stuff tonight, we're putting it all on the table for people. Wilson did see an increase in role, so he can be one of those backup type bid guys if you're hurting.
How about Danny Amendola? 13 targets for little Danny Amendola. You've got to assume that Chris Harris covers Kenny Golladay, leaving Amendola to be the only guy that, and I'll steal this from the Friday Night ETR show, Bing Bang Blau throws to.
That is great. I hadn't heard that yet.
I tweeted that to the guys over the weekend. That's tremendous.
That's
nickname.
awesome.
Bing Bang, Bling Blang Blau. Either way, he sucks. Danny Amendola, let's be honest here. Someone's got to catch the ball. 13 targets, nothing to sneeze at. He's playing Tampa Bay.
Yeah, and Amendola, here's the good news. He's not just playing the slot now. 65% of his routes came from the slot, but he's actually he's out there on the field in two wide receiver sets. 98% of routes per drop back to Kenny Golladay, and second on the team was 90% to Danny Amendola. We talked about this last week, and we expected to see him see an increase in targets, and that's actually what happened. The two previous weeks weren't bad, 21 and 20%. Not great when you have Bing Bang Blau or whatever we're calling him at the helm, but last week that jumped to 30%. And so he is getting, the work from the slot. He's kicking outside in the two wide receiver sets. So look, I hate recommending guys with super crappy quarterbacks. But like you said, the matchup, isn't terrible. And again, if you're in a pinch, Amendola, he's going to be one of the top two guys targeted this weekend on the Lions. It's just going to happen.
Chad, what do you think about these Lions receivers?
I like Amendola more than many of the guys we've discussed previously, but he's also not as available as much as they are either. So
let's stick with the Lions here. And there's rumors Kerryon Johnson could be activated this week. We saw that they're down a running back now. Ty Johnson took over the remainder of that game. J.D. McKissick got banged up. And then we see something called Wes Hills. I don't know.
Not Peyton Hillis.
No, but so we got him in the mix. If Kerryon Johnson, if we see he's activated this week, guys, is there any chance week 16 you're playing for money, you're plugging him in a lineup?
I'm letting
Don't
Chad
all answer
go first. I feel like I've been jumping in first every time.
About where I would draw the line on that is like, and I have teams like this, and I have Kerryon a little bit. I re-added him, I don't know why, because now I have to freaking deal with this. But like if you have Patrick Laird, for instance,
yes,
I might rather play Kerryon Johnson and just see what happens, because I'm not going to get much out of Laird most likely.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. He's going to be out there, Dwayne. He's sitting on waiver wires. Everybody cut him.
Yeah, I would agree with Chad. I think that, and the line's probably a little higher than that. We would have to really jump into what some of these scenarios are. For example, I might prefer to go ahead and give him a shot, over, the Buccaneer running backs, because that's just a complete three-way split. There's some chance that all of a sudden Kerryon comes back and maybe at least gets half the work, because Ty Johnson, let's face it, hasn't been good. Like you said, J.D. McKissick's banged up. Bo Scarborough's out. Wes Hills, is really just a guy. And so I think what it really comes down to is how good they really feel about Kerryon Johnson. Is he fully healed? So I think he's a good pickup. What I would want to see is full practice all the way. I really, or at least working up to, a full, or at least, a couple of full practices this week would make me feel even a little bit better. And let's face it, Ty Johnson's just been terrible. He's been given, opportunities to take this backfield over for stretches of time. He just hasn't been able to do it. He just doesn't seem to understand, blocking schemes and things like that in front of him. He seems to just be a fast guy. And so I think, Kerryon could get into a groove and, he could do a little bit of damage, but I'm with Chad. The bar is still pretty low, but it would be in those scenarios where I think there are 2- and 3-way backfield splits. I would start leaning a little bit more to the talent like Kerryon, versus some of the other guys, just because we know he has some sort of upside as far as big playability.
Lastly, let's talk about Anthony Miller. Guy went off 9 for 118 and 1. He gets Kansas City this week, and I think that game is going to be a possible shootout. A lot of implied points. So, your thoughts on Anthony Miller and any of the Bears guys? We'll start with you, Chad.
I'm inclined to ride the wave. It seems like the Bears have taken the game management label off of Trubisky here lately a little bit. They're letting him run the ball a little bit and just kind of play, and that's what he's not a game manager. Let's face it. They were using him wrong. If they want to play that way, then just play the other veteran, Chase Daniel. Game manager Trubisky is not, but he can produce if you let him play. He'll also make some boneheaded plays, but the Bears, to maximize their upside, they got to just let Trubisky play, and they finally started figuring it out way too late. But we have to watch on Gabriel, but at this point, I'm not sure it really even matters. Miller probably is just going to be out there for his normal allotment that he's been in the last few weeks.
Well, so that's kind of a wrap on the guys that we're talking about for week 16. I wanted to get into, though, Chad, you have just such an interesting story that fantasy football is your full-time job, correct?
I'm still a professional gambler as well, but fantasy football full season is definitely my primary job now. I do play a lot of DFS, but not in football, ironically. I just don't have time for it. I'm setting a couple hundred lineups on Sunday mornings doesn't leave a lot of time. So I play a lot of NASCAR and baseball and NBA playoff basketball, DFS, and then I still gamble on sports some. But yeah, it's generally, to put it in perspective, I'm in for $457,000 in full season entry fees this year. So
$457,000.
So it's no joke. And so it's a tense moment, here. This last week's going to be intense.
If you see cocktails and dreams in a chat room or in a draft, man, shit's about to get real. This guy's paying attention. He's coming for that cash. Man, oh man. So how much money, how many finals are you playing for this week?
I don't know. A lot of the leagues I play in the high stakes circuit that a lot of guys in the room, NFFC and FFPC and FFWC. I made, I think 12 out of 15. Most of those, the top 4 make it out of 12. In the 5K or larger leagues, I made 12 of the 15 playoffs at those places. But they work in a different way. You don't have a matchup each week. Starting week 14, it's a 3-week race among the 4 teams, similar to how the overall contests work. And it's probably a more fair way to decide the money. So it's hard to quantify what's a final and what's not. But what I can say is I have to look, but I have $374,000 recouped already, which is a pretty damn good number considering there's no way to recoup a lot of that until this week. So
sure.
I have 89 different ways to get more of that back. So,
good luck, man. And here's what I want to ask. I'm a guy obsessed with process. So what do you do as someone who's putting major money on the line? And this is your livelihood, this in sports gambling. what do you do? It's the off season. It's, June, football's getting real fired up. Dwayne and I, we're doing shows and we're talking about what we see in camp and all that. What is a guy like you doing? How do you prepare for draft season?
Nothing.
I'm
watching NASCAR races and playing very heavy DFS NASCAR on Sundays, and playing DFS baseball at the start of the season until I get burned out, which is usually around June. And then I take a couple months basically off from everything after the NBA playoffs are over, and just sort of let my brain get recharged and until I start drafting. And that's usually around August 10th. And then from then on, it's, 7-8 drafts a night usually. So
you're not a guy who's out there every night. You're reading everything. You're listening to 50 podcasts a week, and you're subscribed to 20 different websites and all that. So you're really just giving your brain a rest, and when it's time to go, it's time to go.
I don't want to allow myself to get preconceived notions on guys way too early.
Okay.
I think that's a weakness of some of my peers that are great players, but I think that sometimes it's hard for people when they form an opinion to get off that opinion. Mm-hmm. And therefore I try to, let's face it, I'll get clobbered my first few drafts, and they'll be like $300 leagues. And I usually don't fare too well on my first few go arounds. And then but the key is to get ramped up and be in game form by the time the larger one rolls down, roll around 10 days later. And then starting like August 25th through the beginning of the season, I'm doing, 12 to 15 drafts a day, and they're really big leagues. So
wow.
I'm doing 4 or 5 at a time oftentimes. So
now we know a guy like Dwayne, he's doing his own projections and he's working for a site like Establish the Run. Are you looking at any sites? Where do you get your projections? Are there any kind of voices out there that you do listen to and you like what they put out?
I definitely watched your guys' show once I discovered it in the preseason. I also watch every preseason game from start to finish, even the crappy ones early in the preseason, because sometimes you'll see a guy flash. Like, I remember Robbie Anderson flashed in some of those garbage games, 1 year, and by the end of the year he was relevant, and so I was able to make appropriate bids knowing what I saw in the preseason. But the main source is I trust the market to be correct. I mean, this day and age, there's so much information out there. So, and when I'm playing against great players in these leagues, who's to say my opinion would even be right anyway? So let the market establish where guys are supposed to go. Let me make adjustments for the particular format. If it's 6 points a TD pass, I want, this year I didn't want Lamar Jackson in those types of leagues. I wanted him in the ones that were 4 points a touchdown pass. Of course, he's leading the league in touchdown passes, so I'm not doing that well at the NFFC this year. But you get the point. I try to own guys where it makes sense in the proper formats. I try to own better tight ends at the FFPC where it's 1.5. I try to own premium tight ends in leagues where you only have an 8-man starting lineup, because you don't have the spots to make up that gap. If you have Kelsey, it's a damn big advantage when they don't have quite the bulk up the middle to make up those differences, So it just all that comes into play on, but it comes back to the ADP list, and I believe in it. And obviously there's guys I don't care for, and they're going to have to drop a lot further than others, but I'm also more open to a vast majority of the players than most of my peers are, and including some that I consider to be better players than I am, that eliminate a lot of players from their pool altogether. They just won't take them. There's different ways to skin a cat, and I do what works best for me. I also like to take guys that I don't love a little bit here and there in these overall races, because let's face it, when you get to this point in the season, over 3 weeks, anybody can go off over a 3-week stretch.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm naked on that guy, I'm not going to win. Whereas like last year, I won the FFWC for 150 grand by having Antonio Brown on a team. He didn't lead too many teams to the playoffs because he was pretty bad. But then he blew up against the Saints and led me to a come from behind thrilling win in an overall contest. And if I had eliminated him and done the same thing every time,
right,
I would not have won that contest. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but I try to keep a diverse portfolio, but also try to avoid the guys I don't like. I make them fall, further. And the way I look at it is if I'm getting guys in every draft I do over 250 teams, if I'm getting guys later than they typically go and I like them, I should wear down the competition over the bulk of my portfolio.
Because you're not a guy who I've heard you do other interviews where you're not a guy who says, I'm going into this and doing 0 RB and I'm not going to go in and go reach for this guy, that guy. You really do just let it fall to you. And you just look at the ADP and you're just kind of a value bargain hunter out there. And that's admirable in a world of high stakes sharks where people think you got to be crazy aggressive and you got to draft. For myself, I did a draft in Canton, Ohio with a bunch of industry guys and I got stuck in the second round where I should have taken either a Derrick Henry or Michael Thomas. I think I took Miles Sanders as trying to shoot for the moon and really win a 14-team draft. And that was a huge mistake on my part. Whereas if I would have taken an approach like yours and taken just Thomas or Henry, my team would have been that much better. So really interesting there. You had a story you told me on Twitter I wanted to get to about how you're close to losing $500,000.
Well,
I cringe reading that.
I cringe talking about it.
I mean,
so
this is $500,000, people.
What's that?
I'm just telling our audience, this isn't like, oh, hey, I'm going to lose $200, but this is $500,000.
Now
this is more money than people make in a decade.
Just to be clear, that might be over dramatizing the situation at this point. I'll just explain the situation. It's brutal and it's infuriating. And I can't believe it happened, but here's what happened. So FFPC, many of the guys here probably have some main event, a team or two, or maybe play football guys contest over there, which kind of works the same way. 4 people make the playoffs after week 11. The first criteria is record. Second criteria is next most points besides that team with the best record. Third seed is the best record that isn't one of those first 2 teams. And then the 4 seed is the next most points that's left. So the top 2 seeds are automatically immune into the overall race for $500,000. The 3 and 4 seeds must win the league playoffs in week 12 and 13. So you have to win 2 matches in a row to go to the overall race, right? Okay. So in a sort of an unlucky turn of events, there was a record team that beat the points leader, and then I'm second in points. And we were way ahead of anybody else in points, but there was a team that ended up in the 1 seed, and that would not have happened if I had lost my match the last week of the season. I was playing the guy that has more points than me. So if I lose that match to him, he would have became the 1 seed instead of the 2 seed. And then I would have slid into the 2 seed as the points representative. That makes sense? Am I talking clearly?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. So, but what happened was Hunter Henry was playing on Monday night, week 11, and I was like 8 or 9 points behind. And I have 72 teams in this contest, and this was team number 71. And I was going through, I started about a few hours before the game, going through all my leagues to look for things that I screwed up setting lineups like I do every Monday night. And I'm on team 69 when the game kicks off.
Oh,
I get to team 71 2 minutes later, or I would have caught this. I needed to bench Hunter Henry, and I would have been the 2 seed and been in the overall race. And it also paid $2,000 to be a top 2 seed, which I pissed away. And then in the finals of the league, I was not able to beat the guy that had the most points. He beat me in the finals. So I go off to the consolation race instead. That team was what I felt was my best team in the contest. It was a Lamar Jackson team with Christian McCaffrey, with Kittle and Ertz and Hunter Henry in a 1.5 premium tight end format. Jacobs is the other running back with Cooper Kupp.
And you can flex those guys in that format.
So I can play all those tight ends.
Yeah.
You know, wide receivers not completely awesome, but Cooper Kupp and Robbie Anderson or Samuel. But it's a damn good team, and I would be in 10th going into the final week if I hadn't made that mistake. And it's very compacted on that leaderboard. I'd be within 20 points of the leader in 10th place. It's, I know mistakes are going to happen when I play that many leagues, but that's just such a preventable one. And I'm so disappointed in myself that I didn't get going a little bit earlier on such an important week. It's also bad luck that it happened to be my 71st team and not one of my first 69, or I would have got to it by kickoff. But that's what happened. And it's going to be really, really painful if that team goes on and wins, would have won 500K. Oh, man.
We got a question in the chat room for you, Chad. Do you play in a lot of best ball formats? Like those NFL pins and all that?
I wouldn't say a lot, but I did partner with a couple of good full season players, and we all entered 150 teams in that draft.com contest, $25 to try to win $1 million. We're all eliminated now. I think I ended up losing a couple $100 or something when it was all said and done, but it was worth it to take a stab, but it didn't work out. But I play in, other than that, I play in 3 $1,250 best balls at FFPC and 2 $1,200 best balls at NFFC. And I love them because you don't have to do anything after the draft. And
right. Do you have a special strategy for best ball, or is it the same as your season long?
It's a little bit different. I want to make sure that I have an allotment of running backs. I used to be really aggressive with running backs in the first part of the draft, but I've backed off that a little bit. But I want to make sure I have quality running backs in those because there's only so many to go around, and if you get too far behind waiting for a guy to come into a role, you're just not going to catch up. So,
now you give advice, and people can actually pay. I mean, that's kind of a side gig you have, right? Is you can do corporate events, and you can do one-on-one stuff where people talk to you about fantasy football. What advice do you give the general fantasy player who's just playing in the league with his buddies, who goes, Chad, come on, you're like the king of fantasy football here. You're number 1 ranked. You're winning all this money. Like, how do you help me get better? What kind of advice do you give to that average fan?
I try to, when I did appearances this year, the first thing I started my presentation with was write down this podcast. And I know that some of the folks that those things now listen to your podcast every single show. That was no kidding. That's the first thing I started my sports.
Thank you so much. Holy
Thanks,
smokes.
man. Yeah.
And then from there, I try to just feel out the crowd and see what kind of level they're at. And, this year I only did a couple sports bar appearances. The previous couple years I've done some awesome charity events where for a big financial analyst here in Omaha. He invites a few, like 10 or 15 of his best clients that like fantasy football, and we just make a night of it. And I go over a presentation. Nelson Sousa, I phoned in to help me out with those, and it was awesome. And raised a few thousand for charity each time, so it was great. But I sort of just try to feel the audience out and see what kind of level they're at, first of all. And then I try to, before anybody leaves, I try to go and talk to each of them privately quick and see if they have any follow-up questions. But I guess it's a little too vague of a question to answer real well. But but the main thing I say is I just keep it simple. You don't need to be a hero, you know. My goal is to win. It isn't to win in a fancy way. I don't care how I win. I just want to win. And for me, keeping it simple is the way to win. And as I've become a big-time DFS player in other sports, I've learned to use DFS concepts to have a good quality lineup out there during bye weeks, off the waiver wire. I subscribe to almost every DFS site there is, because I respect their projections, oftentimes more than the full season sites, and sort of turn each league that I am in into basically a weekly contest and try to have the best lineup I can. So I set my lineup before waivers run, and then when I go to do waivers, I look and see who am I not comfortable with and what can I do about it, you know. And I'm very aggressive streaming kickers, defenses, and streaming that last spot or two in my lineup.
Chad, how many weeks ahead do you start looking on some of those, you know, especially in some of the more, you know, aggressive leagues? Because I know there are times where, you know, for me, you know, I may look 2 weeks ahead, you know, on the defense. If I'm in a super competitive, and you figure it out, some leagues you're in are more competitive than others. You know, there will be nothing on the wire, you know, in some leagues. And then other leagues, you'll go look and you're like, wow, every defense is available. So in some of those, do you pay attention to things like that? I'm guessing that you do. You're kind of scouting the league, and based on
I wish I had time to do more of that, but I'm at very tight time constraints. I don't have a half hour spent on each team. And I don't get done with my free agency on some of my smaller teams once in a while as it is. So I generally don't look more than at this week. But that's something that I should be doing. That there's trade-offs if you want to run a lot of teams. And then it just becomes a question of, do you want to do every team exactly optimally? Or are you still better off having more teams and not doing them quite optimally? Or are you still going to be more profitable?
Yeah,
that's what the question is. And I've decided that having more teams is more profitable than doing every team exactly optimally.
Talking here with Chad Schroeder at Chad SCH23 on Twitter. You may know him because he's the best fantasy football player in America. Forget that, in the world. Number one ranked player 5 times in a row. Reigning NFFC primetime and FFWC world champion. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that. And the fact that this guy listens to our show is such an honor, man. And the fact that you recommend it to other people, we really can't thank you enough. That's amazing. You guys want to take a couple questions from the chat room before we get out of here? These guys are dying to talk to you folks.
Sure, I'm down if Chad is.
Absolutely. I got all night, however long you want to stay on. So.
We'll crack some more beers here. All right. Let's see. 2 questions for Dwayne and Chad. This comes from Steven Dominguez. Half point PPR, Landry, Fuller, or McLaurin? We'll start with you, Chad. Half PPR, Landry, Fuller, or McLaurin?
Okay, now just so we're clear here, I don't start my process of lineup setting until Thursday when there's a Thursday night game. So I certainly am not engaged in it yet. I'll become a little more engaged in it tomorrow because I'll be doing some waivers tomorrow. But that being said, I'll try to do the best I can. But so ask the question again.
So half point PPR, he's looking for a wide receiver here. out of Landry, Fuller, or Terry McLaurin?
If the weather is weather permitting, it's going to be hard for Fuller not to be one of them, I think. Tampa's secondary is atrocious. And I would probably lean Landry just on, amount of targets. But they're all pretty good options. Want to watch the weather. Maybe the weather is going to be cold and windy in Cleveland. That's always subject to change. I slightly lean Fuller and Landry. But
how about you, Dwayne?
Yeah, I'm going to lean. I'm going to lean the same way, but I'm with Chad. It's really hard. So, this weekend right now, only 7-mile-an-hour wind. In Cleveland, 35 degrees. That's not enough to hurt. But Baltimore does have really good cornerbacks. But if I were to want a matchup, I would want the inside matchup. Against the Ravens. I don't want to be jacking around with Marlon Humphreys outside, which Odell Beckham's going to have to deal with. Then you got Peters, playing as well on the outside. So I feel like Jarvis Landry is going to be almost. It could be a funnel situation, especially if you have Njoku out again. I could easily see Landry and Kareem Hunt leading the team, in targets this weekend. And it's just something that we've seen over and over. If you look at the target shares, for Jarvis Landry, only 19% last week, but, over the previous 3 weeks, he's at 25, 30%. McLaurin, it's like Chad said, you're going to have to watch the weather in Tampa. Right now, I might be scared off of it because once you start getting to 20 miles an hour, it hurts the deep passing game, which is really where Fuller, you want to have that in play. If you're playing Will Fuller, you want the deep passing game, in play. His average depth of target is a 15. And so I might swing, if I'm wanting more upside, and I'm wanting to hit, some big plays, I feel like I'm an underdog at that point. I might flip off of Fuller to McLaurin, over Landry. But if I feel like I'm in the lead, the guy that I feel like is the easiest money in the game is Landry, just because we know his role pretty much week in and week out.
Here's a in-depth question right here. So this gentleman has all 3 Vikings running backs, okay? His other running back is Josh Jacobs. So his question is, if Jacobs is out, do I start DeAndre Washington on Sunday or wait until Monday and put in whatever Vikings guy starts? So really it's a question of, am I playing Raiders guys or Vikings guys? And just for, clarity here, we've got, let's see, where is the Raiders? Who are the Raiders playing this week? They're on the road.
Yeah, they get the Chargers. The matchups are almost the same. Green Bay for Minnesota is a plus 1.9, the way I look at these things with some of the tools I use. Oakland is a plus, 2.1 versus the Chargers. So matchups are about the same. I'd be curious to see, what Chad thinks on this one. But for me, what this one, I hate to say depends, but since this guy already owns all of these, he doesn't have to go pick them up. He can watch this play out. If for some reason Madison doesn't practice this week and we're going into Monday night with it just being Dalvin Cook and Boone, I might risk it. But if Madison practices, and we're also hearing Cook could play, and we still got Boone in the picture, I'm gonna switch to DeAndre Washington if Josh Jacobs is out, because the matchups are equal. I just want the guy with the volume. Would I rather have Minnesota's running game? If I knew who was going to get it, absolutely. But I feel like there's just more inherent risk, swinging for the if you're going to wait on Monday night, even though you own all 3 players. Now, if it works out where Madison's not playing, and that early on, and all you got to do is you get lucky and, Dalvin Cook's not going to play, or, Boone's going to at least be involved, to some extent anyway, that's what could swing it, back, the other way, because I do like the running game for the Vikings, better than Oakland. I like their overall offense better, and I like their defense's ability to keep their running game intact through games better than I like that of Oakland.
I agree exactly with what Dwayne said. If you can narrow down the pool to an either-or situation, I would be very comfortable playing Boone if we know Madison's out. That's exactly what he said is exactly what I think.
I can answer this one, but they want the smart guys, I guess. Dak or Tannehill this week? The answer is Dak Prescott. But we'll throw it to you guys. Chad, start with you. Dak Prescott or Ryan Tannehill?
Well, I'm not going to go against. You said you could answer it, so I'm going to.
Yeah, Dak Prescott's going to throw for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. He'll probably run one in against. Have you seen this Eagles secondary, folks? My God. Drake Jordan's sweet Gam could score on these guys.
And look, hey, it's a little closer, than we think. But here's what I'm counting on. I know Philly struggled some, but I'm counting on a competitive game. And that's, man, as soon as you say that in the NFL, Chad, you can step in here because, you put money on the games way more than I do. I mostly just play fantasy, but I expect these two teams to put everything they have out there, and it should be a competitive game. The one thing I worry, about, Cincinnati and Miami, they're both bad. So, I mean, it should be equal footing, but they're also two teams that either one of them can lay an egg, any week. And does Miami have to keep the pedal to the metal? I don't know. You've also got potential weather issues in Miami, just like you do in Tampa. Not quite as bad, but they're saying, 15, 16, 17 mile an hour winds, a little bit less, than Tampa.
Hold up, Wayne, we're talking about Tannehill here? Or?
Yeah, Tannehill versus Cincinnati. Yeah. Oh, sorry. What am I doing? Tennessee. I was thinking of Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, I was just wanting you to keep going.
I worry about you're going to get AJ.
No, you get New Orleans.
Sorry. Yeah, with Lattimore on the outside. Now you got to try to throw to some of these ancillary weapons that I'm not too fired up about. Jonnu Smith and Corey Davis. I mean,
yeah, Lattimore has been a true shutdown. There's not really as many as people think in the league. Well, some of that's just because teams don't move them around. They just leave them on one side of the field, which sometimes I don't get. But yeah, sorry. Thanks, Chad, for jumping in. But man, that makes it tougher because Tennessee's playing to keep their playoffs alive. New Orleans is playing for seeding. Man, I'm still going to lean Dak because I do like the passing matchup better. I think both games could be, competitive and put points up though.
Yeah, I lean Dak, but it's closer than one would think for sure.
Yeah, Tannehill, man, it's crazy what he's done if you're just looking at, his points per drop back, Drake, over the season, he ranks number 2
in the
behind Lamar Jackson. Lamar
Jackson's decade, right? It's some crazy number. I read the PFF article.
Lamar Jackson, is like way up there in the last decade. 9.1 points per drop back to pass. But Tannehill's second in the league on the year at 6.9%. I want to say Mahomes was in the 7.5%, 8% range last year on that number. Don't quote me. So, I mean, that kind of gives you the range though of greatness that we're dealing with. I mean, Tannehill's not quite in that company, but this season, I mean, he's second in the league on a per drop back basis, less attempts than these other guys, less dropbacks, but man, he's been so good. And he and AJ Brown, man, they're making, sweet music.
How about, let's go here. Full PPR, Perriman, Hollywood Brown, or Anthony Miller.
Chad, you go on this one.
I like Perriman personally. Again, if the weather, it starts getting up to 22, 23 miles an hour plus, and then if there's some rain, then you wait and figure it out as you go and bench Perriman. But if the weather, if it's 15, 16 mile an hour winds or lower, no rain or whatnot, Winston's just such a gunslinger, and Perriman is on such a roll right now. And he also, the thing with him is he can be coming up small the whole game, and he can save it on one play.
Yep.
So can Hollywood Brown, but I'm more comfortable with Perriman, and that's very surprising to say. But I just seems like they'll even scheme him some stuff to get open.
Yeah, I agree. If the weather works out, I think it's Perriman I hate ever saying slam dunk, but I mean, I pretty easily would make the decision to be Perriman. Now, if the wind and the weather does become an issue, which we've mentioned multiple times, no need to recap that, Chad just did. But if that does continue to be an issue, I also would continue to lean towards, Anthony Miller, just because as much as I like what's going on with Hollywood Brown, his routes per dropback are actually, I think he's finally healthy, 81% and 85% these last 2 weeks. Nobody passes the ball less than the Ravens. And yes, it's explosive. So, you got Lamar Jackson throwing 5 touchdowns. But there's less of a pie to go around. Anthony Miller and Allen Robinson are basically the Bears passing game right now. Now, there's always a caveat. If Taylor Gabriel ends up being active, so the weather's bad in Tampa, Taylor Gabriel, you hear early enough because that's a Sunday night game against the Chiefs. You hear that Taylor Gabriel is going to be active, which I have no clue if you'll know that or not. Then I would go Marquise Brown.
Great.
Last one here, guys, because we're running long. We still got to get to the 2-time high-stakes dynasty champ, Drake Jordan. That interview coming up momentarily. So last one, you got to sit one of these players. Sit one of these guys. James White, Mostert, Diggs, Lockett, Perriman. So again, one of those guys on the bench, James White, Raheem Mostert, Steph Diggs, Lockett, or Perriman.
White, Diggs, Lockett, Perriman.
And Mostert. We're going through this whole guy's freaking roster.
Yeah, that's okay.
Good God.
Gam and everyone else too. Put them in.
Okay.
PPR? Or we don't
Standard.
know?
Standard.
Okay.
Well, that helps.
The one guy still playing in a standard league.
Who was the very last player?
Rashad Perriman.
Oh, sorry. Make sure I got him right, Drake. White, Diggs, Lockett, Perriman, Mostert.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and make mine. I'm benching James White.
Same.
In that scenario.
I agree. Yeah. I agree.
Again, watching the weather. If it's going to be a complete,
because he just doesn't run the ball.
Yeah.
I want big play potential out of receivers in a standard league, or a guy that's going to run the ball, and he doesn't do either one. So that's where I'd be.
I agree. I think Mostert, he gets the shot to run it in, from the 5 and in here lately. So I'm sticking with him, and I'm with Chad. I like each one of those receivers. All of those receivers have the ability to put up big target shares and big plays. So I'm going with those.
Chad, any good betting info
I want to ask Dwayne one lineup.
Sure.
And you for that. So the FFPC main event, I'm in 7th place, and I have to choose between for 2 spots, Cooper Kupp, Higbee, Fuller, and Diggs.
And you need 2?
Yeah, 1.5 for Higbee.
Yeah. I love that format. Okay, let me look real quick because I haven't looked at the Rams.
I'm looking at the 49ers.
At the 49ers, yeah. I'm just looking at my matchup sheet. I know the 49ers are tough, but not as tough inside. It's kind of a funnel thing. The Rams
I like Higbee. I think I got to get him in there with the 1.5. The way they're using him.
I played him last week over Diggs, and that kept me in contention. So, but I don't know.
Yeah,
you don't need to hash it out, but maybe you could get back to me on that, Dwayne, later.
Well, I think Fuller's the guy that I'm eliminating up front.
I tend to agree. Yeah.
And then I've got it down to Kupp, Higbee, and Diggs. Obviously Higbee could eliminate himself if for some reason Gerald Everett is going to play.
Right.
That becomes problematic for him. But Kupp, man, God, this is a tough one, Chad.
I know.
That's a tough one. Just because, the thing with, the Rams these last several weeks, really. And, I actually wrote about this on Establish the Run about 7 weeks ago, that, it was becoming more up and down for Cooper Kupp as far as, the way these game scripts were playing out and, his snaps and his routes, per drop back. If they're in shootouts, it's fine, or if they're trailing by a lot, it's fine, which, I tend to think against the 49ers with so much on the line, the Rams are either going to be getting their butts kicked or they're going to be in a tight game. I don't see them blowing out the 49ers because the 49ers lost last week and they still have something to play for. So I would tend to lean towards Kupp having a big role in the game, as far as being on the field. But with this emergence of the tight end, man, it's just hurt the inside passing game. Only 13, and 12% of the targets over the last 3 weeks for Kupp. But I tell you what, I still would I like that better than I do Diggs, just because of the ability of Minnesota just to totally shut down their passing game at times. I mean, they'll just turn it off. Like they just turn the faucet off. And we've seen it multiple times. So I think that would give it a slight edge, but maybe Gerald Everett makes sure.
Play? Well, let's say, Cook doesn't play, Madison doesn't play, and it's Mike Boone out there. You got to think they're going to try to throw the ball a little more. They're not going to lean on Mike Boone and Amir Abdullah for 4 quarters.
Man, maybe, you never know. It's Gary Kubiak's offense, and they kind of take pride on they don't care which runner it is. They believe the scheme is a huge part of it. It's that outside and inside zone. And they bring guys in that they think can all run that scheme. And Boone showed us that he can last week. I think I agree. Drake, you could probably see a little bit more, but my other concern is that Thielen's going to be another week healthy. This last week we didn't see a ton, from Thielen. So I think that's just, another thing that makes me lean slightly towards Cooper Kupp, who's really been the better player all year too. So that's a tough one though, man. I could see how you're definitely in a jam. I would be, I
think I have it down sort of to Diggs and Higbee, but,
well, no, you're saying I was saying.
My worst fear here is that I screw up the lineup and lose 500,000.
Oh,
and the other team would have won for that would have been in 10th if I didn't mangle that one already.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, Diggs just needs a game. Diggs just needs a game script that's really competitive against Green Bay. His targets have been fine: 24, 27, 24%. Chad, the problem these last several weeks. Listen to their dropbacks. 40% of the plays they drop back. Well, they won the game by 29. 44% of the dropbacks, they won the game by 13. The week before, they lose by 7, and they drop back to pass 73% of the time. I don't know that made your decision easier because I expect Green Bay to give everything they have in this game as well. It's a Monday night game. I mean, you could see, Minnesota need to pass the ball, a little bit more, in this particular, matchup, to keep up, with what Green Bay may try to put out there. Man, this is a really tough one. I mean,
might revisit it with you later in the week.
Yeah, we can revisit on it for sure. Maybe, like you said, we'll have a little bit more information on weather and any other potential guys. But I think, Fuller's out, and it's down to Kupp, Higbee, and Diggs.
Well, folks,
for what it's worth, just real quick, Higbee, sorry, Drake. Higbee, all right. It all happened at the end. It was all dump off junk when they were down by 14. I don't know how much that, about by 21 points actually, because I did watch every snap of that game. So I don't know how much that helps either, because they could be in the same situation against the 49ers.
It was all garbage time. Gurley and then Kupp with the late score. It was all garbage time.
I'm hoping Everett comes back.
That makes your choice easier.
Because there's a few guys up there ahead of me that have Higbee as well. I need to also analyze the rosters and make sure that I have a clear path, that enough differences to make up. I'm only like 12 points behind in 7th place from the lead. So it's very, very tight. So
I know the feeling, man. I've definitely been there. I haven't, lost, the heartbreaker you did for the Millie. But the $250K 2 years ago in the FFPC, I was one Zach Ertz catch away from the 250 and took second instead. So I feel your angst and your pain.
Well, I don't. I have no idea what you guys are talking about. So,
Drake, you're playing in a free beer league somewhere this weekend.
I'm playing for a freaking bronze toilet against my fraternity brother. But Chad, thank you so much. Chad Schroeder at ChadSCH23 on Twitter. Probably the best fantasy player in America. I mean, if you're going to follow somebody, why not follow him, folks? So give him a follow on there. Thank you so much for coming and spending an hour and a half with the Fantasy Football Hustle, man. We truly, truly appreciate your kind words.
Thanks for the invite, guys.
Yeah, man. Cool. Thanks, Chad. Always a pleasure to have you.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here, guys. On the other side, we're going to come back. We've got the two-time high-stakes dynasty champ Drake Jordan. We'll be with him momentarily here on the Fantasy Football Hustle.